The Ring of Solomon, Between Legend and Light. A bedtime history for gentle sleep. Opening, the whisper of ancient gold. Close your eyes now and imagine with me. Imagine a ring turning slowly in the warm light of an oil lamp. The lamp flickers in a palace chamber somewhere in the distant past, and the ring catches the light with each rotation. Gold, perhaps, or brass worn smooth by time, or something else entirely, something that exists only in the mind's eye in the realm of story and symbol. Tonight, we journey together through one of history's most enduring mysteries. Not a mystery of hidden treasure or lost artifacts, but something perhaps more profound. The question of whether an object can be both real and imagined, both physical and spiritual, both historical and eternal. Tonight, we explore the Ring of Solomon. Let your breathing slow. Let your muscles relax. As we move through this story, there is no need to remember every detail, no test waiting at the end. Simply let the words wash over you like gentle waves, carrying you toward the shores of sleep. The Ring of Solomon appears in countless texts across centuries and cultures. In Jewish tradition, Islamic legend, Christian mysticism, and occult writings, this ring surfaces again and again, sometimes as a simple golden band, sometimes as an elaborate seal bearing divine names, sometimes as pure metaphor. Our question tonight is deceptively simple. Was Solomon's ring an object you could hold in your hand, or was it always a symbol, a way of speaking about wisdom, power, and the relationship between the human and the divine? To answer this question, or rather to explore it, for some questions are meant to be lived with rather than solved, we must travel slowly through time, letting each era reveal its own understanding. We begin, as we must, with Solomon himself. Part 1. The historical Solomon and the silence of Scripture. In the land we now call Israel, around the year 970 BCE, a young man came to power. His name was Solomon, and he was the son of King David, the warrior poet who had united the Hebrew tribes into a kingdom. The historical record for this period is sparse, fragmentary, archaeological evidence mixed with later writings. But from what scholars can piece together, Solomon inherited a small but strategically important kingdom at the crossroads of ancient trade routes. Let yourself drift back to that world. The morning air is cool in Jerusalem. The city is smaller than you might imagine, its walls encompassing perhaps 10 acres, its population measured in hundreds rather than thousands. But it sits on a hilltop, and in the growing light of dawn, it commands views of the surrounding valleys. Solomon walks these walls, a young king facing the challenges of succession, of maintaining what his father built, of proving himself to tribal elders and neighboring powers. The Bible gives us our earliest accounts of Solomon. The books of Kings and Chronicles, written down centuries after Solomon's death but preserving older oral traditions, tell us many things about this king. We hear of his wisdom, most famously in the story of the two women claiming the same baby, where Solomon's proposal to cut the child in half reveals the true mother through her compassion. We hear of his building projects, the temple in Jerusalem, his palace, fortifications throughout the land. We hear of his wealth, his diplomatic marriages, his reputation that brought the Queen of Sheba to his court. We hear of his later years, when his many foreign wives led him into idolatry, and how the kingdom began to fracture even before his death. But here is what we do not hear in these biblical accounts: any mention of a magical ring. Let that absence settle in your mind. The books that tell us so much about Solomon, his wisdom, his buildings, his wealth, his failings, remain utterly silent about a ring that would later dominate legends about him. 1 Kings tells us that God appeared to Solomon in a dream at Gibon and offered him anything he desired. Solomon asked for wisdom, for an understanding heart to judge your people, to discern between good and evil. God was pleased with this request and granted Solomon not only wisdom, but also riches and honor, so that no king would be his equal. This is the foundational story of Solomon's gifts. No ring is mentioned. The author of Kings had access to court records, to the Book of the Acts of Solomon, now lost to us. If a magical ring had been part of the official royal regalia, surely it would have appeared in these annals. If Solomon had possessed an object that gave him power over spirits, that allowed him to understand the speech of animals, that bore the ineffable name of God, surely this would have been recorded, celebrated, preserved as carefully as the golden vessels of the temple. But Scripture is silent. This silence is important. Rest with it for a moment. In the earliest layer of tradition about Solomon, what we find is not an object but a gift directly from God, wisdom. Hakma in Hebrew, a word that carries connotations not just of intelligence but of practical knowledge, discernment, the ability to see truly and judge justly. This wisdom was not mediated through an object. It was a quality of Solomon's mind and heart, granted by divine grace. 2 Chronicles, written even later, adds detail about the temple and Solomon's wealth but remains equally silent about any ring. The Psalms and Proverbs attributed to Solomon likewise contain no reference to such an object. Even the Song of Songs, that most mysterious and symbolic of biblical books, speaks of many things: love, desire, gardens, jewels, but never of a special ring. So we must note this carefully. In the canonical Hebrew Bible, there is no ring of Solomon. The legendary ring appears only in later traditions, in texts written centuries after Solomon's death, in cultures and languages far from ancient Jerusalem. To understand how the ring entered the story, we must follow the branching paths of tradition as they spread across the ancient world. Breathe slowly. Let your jaw relax. We are moving now from what history can tell us toward what tradition has preserved. This is not a journey from truth to falsehood, but a journey from one kind of truth to another, from the truth of historical fact to the truth of meaning, symbol, and story. Part 2. The Seeds of Legend in Second Temple Judaism. Between the return from Babylonian exile around 538 BCE and the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, Jewish culture underwent profound transformations. This period, which scholars call Second Temple Judaism, saw the rise of new forms of literature, new ways of interpreting scripture, new questions about the divine and the demonic. Imagine the world of this time. The great empires Persia, then Greece, then Rome roll over the small land of Judea. Jewish communities spread throughout the Mediterranean and Near East. In Alexandria, Egypt, Jews speak Greek and begin to see their traditions through Hellenistic lenses. New texts emerge, some preserved in what Christians would later call the Apocrypha, others surviving only in fragments or translations. It is in these new texts, these interpretive expansions of the biblical story, that we begin to see the seeds of what would become the legend of Solomon's ring. The Book of Wisdom, composed in Greek probably in Alexandria in the 1st century BCE, speaks of Solomon's knowledge in new terms. God granted me to speak as I would, and to conceive thoughts worthy of what I have received, says the voice identified as Solomon, for he himself is the guide of wisdom and the director of the wise. For in his hand are both we and our words and all wisdom and skill in crafts. Notice the language here, in his hand. The idea of divine power mediated through or symbolized by the hand would prove important. But more significant are texts like the Testament of Solomon, probably composed in Greek somewhere between the 1st and 5th centuries CE, though drawing on older traditions. This text, which was never part of the biblical canon but was widely read in early Christian and Jewish communities, gives us one of the first extended accounts of Solomon commanding demons. Let the story unfold in your mind like a dream. According to the Testament of Solomon, when the young king was building the temple, a demon began to torment one of his favorite workers, a young boy, stealing half his wages and draining his vitality. Solomon prayed to God for help, and in response, the archangel Michael descended from heaven. Michael brought Solomon a ring, a small gold ring bearing a seal. The seal, Michael explained, was engraved with a special sign, a pentalpha, a 5-pointed star, or according to some versions, the name of God himself. With this ring, Solomon could command any demon. He had only to press the seal against the demon's chest, and the demon would be bound to his will. Picture Solomon receiving this gift. The angel's wings fold the light around them. The ring is small, almost insignificant, just a band of gold with a mark upon it. But Michael's words invest it with cosmic power. By this you shall bind all demons, both male and female, and with their help you shall build Jerusalem. And so Solomon did. He summoned the demon tormenting his worker, a creature named Ornias, and bound him with the ring. Then he commanded Ornias to bring him the prince of demons, Beelzebul himself. One by one, Solomon called forth the demons, questioned them about their nature and their powers, learned their weaknesses, and set them to work cutting stones, transporting materials, and shaping the temple. This text is fascinating in many ways. It shows us a Judaism beginning to develop an elaborate demonology, likely influenced by Persian Zoroastrian ideas about cosmic dualism. It shows us the temple, that central symbol of divine presence, being built with the forced labor of evil spirits, a paradox rich with meaning. And it gives us, for the first time, a clear account of Solomon's ring as an object of power. But notice what the ring does in this account. It does not make Solomon wise. His wisdom is assumed, granted directly by God as in the biblical account. The ring does not allow him to speak with animals or understand all languages. Its power is specific, authority over demons. The ring is a tool for a particular purpose, the building of the temple. It is divine power mediated through an object, but in a focused, limited way. And notice something else. Even in this text, there is ambiguity. Is the ring's power in the physical object, the gold and the engraving, or in what it represents? When Solomon presses the seal against a demon, is it the metal that binds, or is it the name of God engraved upon it? And if it is the name that holds power, then is the ring merely a convenient surface for writing that name, no more magical than ink on parchment? The Testament of Solomon was not considered scripture, not even by those communities that cherished it. It was something else, a midrash, an expansion, a meditation on themes present in the biblical text. It asked, if Solomon was so wise, if his power was so great that even the Queen of Sheba marveled, what might that have looked like? How might such power have been expressed? Other Jewish texts from this period offer different answers. The alphabet of Ben Sira, a medieval text drawing on older traditions, speaks of Solomon controlling demons but does not emphasize a ring. Rabbinic literature in the Talmud and Midrash contains scattered references to Solomon's supernatural knowledge, but is generally cautious about attributing magical powers to him, preferring to emphasize his wisdom as discernment and judgment. So even as the legend of the ring begins to take shape, it remains fluid, uncertain, contested. Some communities preserve stories of a physical ring. Others speak only of Solomon's God-given authority over the spirit world. Still others reject the entire notion as dangerous superstition, insisting that the biblical text tells us all we need to know. Solomon was wise because God made him wise, period. Your breathing is slower now. You can feel the weight of your body against the surface beneath you. We are moving through centuries, through communities separated by language and geography, watching a legend grow like a tree from a seed. We are not yet ready to answer our question, object or symbol, but we are beginning to understand that perhaps the question itself is part of the mystery. Part 3. Islamic Traditions and the Seal of Suleiman. In the early 7th century CE, in the Arabian Peninsula, a new revelation emerged. Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, received messages that would be compiled into the Quran, and those messages included many stories of earlier prophets. Among them was Solomon, whose story would be told in new ways with new emphases and, yes, with a ring. Let your mind travel south and east from Jerusalem, across the deserts of Arabia to the cities of Mecca and Medina. Here, Jewish, Christian, and indigenous Arab traditions mixed and mingled. Oral storytelling was a high art. The Quran itself came through oral recitation, each surah revealed over time, committed to memory, and only later written down. In this culture, stories of ancient prophets were treasured, elaborated, debated. The Quran mentions Suleiman in several places. Surah 2, verse 102, speaks of Solomon and the demons, and they followed what the devils recited during the reign of Solomon. It was not Solomon who disbelieved, but the devils disbelieved, teaching people magic. This passage seems to defend Solomon against accusations of sorcery. It was not Solomon who practiced dark magic, but demons who worked during his reign. Surah 21, verses 81-82, tells us, "And to Solomon we subjected the wind, blowing forcefully, proceeding by his command toward the land which we had blessed. And we were knowing of all things. And of the devils were those who dove for him and did work other than that, and we were guardian over them." And Surah 27, verses 15-19, gives us a story of Solomon and the ants. "And we had certainly given to David and Solomon knowledge, and they said, 'Praise be to Allah who has favored us over many of his believing servants.' And Solomon inherited David. He said, 'O people, we have been taught the language of birds, and we have been given from all things. Indeed, this is evident bounty.' And gathered for Solomon were his soldiers of the jinn and men and birds, and they were marching in rows, until when they came upon the valley of the ants, an ant said, 'O ants, enter your dwellings that you not be crushed by Solomon and his soldiers while they perceive not.' So Solomon smiled, amused at her speech." These Quranic passages establish several things. Solomon commanded the wind. He had authority over jinn spirits, similar to but not identical with Jewish and Christian concepts of demons. He could understand the language of animals, and he possessed great knowledge and power. All of this was from Allah, a divine gift to a righteous prophet. But again, no explicit mention of a ring in the Quran itself. However, Islamic tradition did not stop with the Quranic text. Just as Jewish tradition had elaborated the biblical accounts, Islamic tradition developed vast collections of hadith, sayings and deeds of the Prophet Muhammad, and Qisas al-Anbiya, stories of the prophets. In these traditions, the ring of Suleiman became a central element of his legend. According to widespread Islamic tradition, Allah gave Suleiman a ring, the seal of Solomon, or Khatam Suleiman. This ring was not merely a tool for commanding spirits, it was the source and symbol of Solomon's entire kingdom. Inscribed upon it was the most great name of Allah, the Ism al-Azam, possession of which granted mastery over all creation. Picture this ring as Islamic tradition describes it. Some accounts say it was made of brass and iron, the brass allowing Solomon to command the good jinn, the iron giving him power over the evil jinn. Others say it was pure gold, or a single perfect jewel, or 4 precious stones representing different powers. The seal upon it was described sometimes as a 6-pointed star, what would later be called the Star of David or Seal of Solomon, sometimes as a more complex geometric pattern, sometimes simply as the divine name in flowing Arabic calligraphy. The most famous story about this ring tells of Solomon's hubris and punishment. According to this tale, Solomon once said something boastful. In some versions, he declared he would have intercourse with 100 wives in one night, and each would bear a son who would fight for Allah. But he forgot to say, willing. For this presumption, Solomon was punished. A demon, often identified as Asmodeus or Sakhar, managed to steal the ring while Solomon was bathing. The demon took Solomon's form and sat upon his throne, ruling in his place. Meanwhile, Solomon, unrecognized and powerless without his ring, wandered as a beggar for 40 days or 40 years in some versions, understanding finally the source of his power and the necessity of humility before Allah. Eventually, through various means, sometimes the demon drops the ring, sometimes it is found inside a fish, sometimes Allah simply ordains its return. Solomon recovers the ring, reclaims his throne, and rules thereafter with greater wisdom and humility. This story appears in various forms in Islamic literature. The great Persian epic poet Ferdowsi, writing around the year 1000 CE, includes a version in his Shahnameh. The story appears in the collections of al-Tabari, al-Thalabi, and other early Islamic historians and story collectors. It becomes a standard element of Islamic teaching about pride and divine sovereignty. Now rest here for a moment with this tradition. In the Islamic telling, the ring is clearly an object, something that can be stolen, lost, recovered. When Solomon possesses it, he rules. When he loses it, he loses everything. The ring is tangible, physical, real in the most straightforward sense. And yet, the ring's power comes not from the metal or jewels, but from the name inscribed upon it. The name is everything. A ring bearing any other inscription would be merely jewelry. It is the divine name, the Ism al-Azam, which represents Allah's essence and authority, that makes the ring powerful. So even in this most object-focused version of the legend, we find ourselves pulled toward the symbolic. The ring is a vehicle for the name, and the name is itself a symbol for divine power. Moreover, the story of Solomon losing the ring functions as a teaching tool. It says to believers, all power comes from Allah. Earthly authority, wealth, wisdom, these are temporary gifts that can be removed in an instant. Solomon on his throne with the ring and Solomon wandering as a beggar without it are the same soul. What differs is not his inner essence but his relationship to divine favor. The ring becomes a symbol of that relationship, a physical representation of spiritual reality. Islamic mystical traditions, Sufism in particular, would develop this symbolic dimension even further. For the Sufis, the wise ones seeking direct experience of the divine, Solomon's ring represented the purified heart. The seal was the stamp of divine truth upon the soul. To possess Solomon's ring was to possess inner knowledge, gnosis, the ability to see beyond surface appearances to spiritual realities. The power over jinn was understood as mastery over the nafs, the lower self with its demons of desire, anger, pride, and fear. Listen to how the great Sufi poet Rumi, writing in the 13th century, speaks of Solomon. Solomon was speaking to the demons and saying, "I have passed beyond you. Be gone." He was not speaking to demons outside. He was speaking to the demons of his own lower nature. For Rumi, the ring is not mentioned because it has been internalized, transformed into a symbol so complete that the physical object becomes unnecessary to the story. You are drifting now between waking and sleeping, between the historical and the symbolic. Hold loosely these different traditions, Jewish and Islamic, textual and oral, literal and mystical. They weave together like threads, creating a pattern larger than any single strand. We are beginning to see that the question object or symbol may be too simple. Perhaps the ring is object and symbol. Perhaps it moves between these states depending on who is telling the story and why. Part 4. Christian Europe and the Grimoires. Time passes. Centuries flow like water. Christianity spreads through Europe, carrying with it texts translated from Greek and Latin, including some of the Jewish pseudepigrapha like the Testament of Solomon. Meanwhile, Muslim conquests bring Islamic learning to North Africa, Iberia, and eventually into Christian Europe through trade and cultural exchange. By the medieval period, let us say the 12th and 13th centuries, European Christians have access to multiple traditions about Solomon. They have the biblical account, which says nothing of a ring. They have translated Greek texts that speak of Solomon's power over demons. They have heard, through various channels, Islamic stories of Solomon's seal. And they have their own needs, their own questions, their own reasons for being interested in such stories. Medieval Europe was a world saturated with the supernatural. Angels and demons were not abstract concepts but understood as real beings, active in the world, capable of helping or harming humans. The church taught that demons were fallen angels, led by Satan, seeking to corrupt and destroy souls. But the church also acknowledged that demons possessed knowledge of hidden things, of future events of the natural world, that humans might access, though doing so was dangerous and potentially sinful. Enter the grimoires, books of magic, handbooks for conjuring and commanding spirits. These texts, written in Latin and later vernacular languages, circulated in manuscript form throughout medieval and early modern Europe. They claimed to offer techniques for making spirits appear, binding them to service, extracting knowledge from them, and sending them away safely. And virtually all of them invoked the authority of Solomon. Lie quietly and picture a dim room, perhaps in a monastery scriptorium or a noble's library. A manuscript lies open on a reading desk, its pages of vellum covered in careful script. The title might be Clavicula Salomonis, the Key of Solomon, or it might be the Testament of Solomon, or the Book of Solomon, or any of dozens of similar titles. And the content describes in elaborate detail how to perform magical operations, with Solomon as the master magician, the model for all who would follow. These grimoires typically include instructions for making a magical ring. The timing must be correct. Often the ring must be forged during specific planetary hours, when particular astrological conditions prevail. The materials matter: gold for solar power, silver for lunar power, or specific alloys. Most importantly, the ring must be inscribed with divine names, angelic names, or geometric seals, pentagrams, hexagrams, complex sigils. The ring is to be consecrated through elaborate rituals involving prayers, fumigations with incense, sprinkling with holy water. Once properly prepared, the ring becomes a tool for the magician, a focus of power, a means of compelling spirits to appear and obey. But here is what is fascinating. In these grimoires, Solomon's ring becomes one ring among many. The magician might make a ring based on Solomon's pattern, but they might also make other rings for other purposes. There are rings to make oneself invisible, rings to win love, rings to protect against poison, rings to gain wealth. The Ring of Solomon becomes a template, a proof of concept, showing that rings can be vessels of magical power. So what has happened to our question? The grimoires seem to answer definitively. The ring is an object, a physical tool that any sufficiently skilled and daring person might create. The instructions are practical, detailed material. They tell you what metals to use, what words to engrave, how to hold your hands, what prayers to say. And yet, read these grimoires carefully, with attention to their underlying assumptions, and a different picture emerges. The ring's power is not intrinsic to the metal. A ring forged with perfect technique, but without the consecration, without the divine names, without the spiritual preparation of the magician, such a ring would be powerless. The physical object is necessary, but it is not sufficient. Moreover, the grimoires exist in a complex relationship with religious orthodoxy. Christian theology considered commerce with demons to be a mortal sin. The Church condemned magic, prohibited the conjuring of spirits, threatened practitioners with excommunication or worse. So why did these texts survive? Why were they copied, preserved, studied? In part because they could be read symbolically. A grimoire might describe a ritual for summoning a demon, but an educated reader could understand this as allegory. The demons represented vices or passions. The process of conjuring and binding them represented spiritual discipline, the control of one's lower nature. The ring represented faith or grace or the power of prayer. Read this way, the grimoires became guides to spiritual development dressed in the language of magic. Some grimoires make this explicit. They include warnings against literal interpretation, hints that the operations are speaking in parables, instructions to understand spiritually what is written corporeally. Others remain studiedly ambiguous, allowing readers to draw their own conclusions. The famous Renaissance magus Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, writing in the early 16th century, discussed Solomon's ring in his De Occulta Philosophia. Agrippa was a complex figure, a scholar, a lawyer, a physician, a seeker after hidden knowledge. He collected magical lore from multiple traditions and attempted to synthesize them into a coherent system. For Agrippa, the Ring of Solomon was real in a specific sense. It was a physical ring that had once existed, made by a king who understood the deep correspondences between material and spiritual realities. Solomon's wisdom allowed him to create an object that resonated with celestial and angelic powers. The ring worked not through crude magic, but through natural magic, understanding, and using the hidden properties of things according to divine plan. But Agrippa also suggested that in his own time, such a ring would be difficult or impossible to recreate. Not because the techniques were lost, Agrippa provided plenty of technical instructions, but because the spiritual conditions had changed. Solomon lived in a time when heaven and earth were closer, when divine revelation was clearer. Modern magicians, Agrippa implied, could perhaps make imitation rings, shadows of the original, but not the real thing. This is a subtle position. The ring was an object, yes, but an object embedded in a particular spiritual context. Remove that context, and you have only metal and stone, empty signifiers. The ring's reality as an object was inseparable from its meaning as a symbol. Your eyelids are heavy now. You feel yourself sinking deeper into rest. We have traveled through Jewish, Islamic, and Christian traditions, and in each we have found the ring appearing now as object, now as symbol, now as something in between. The more we explore, the less certain we become, and that uncertainty is not a failure of understanding but perhaps the point. Some truths can only be approached, never grasped. Like the ring itself, they slip through our fingers even as we reach for them. Part 5. The ring in Jewish mysticism. We must return to Jewish tradition, but now to a different branch, a different stream of interpretation. While Rabbinic Judaism had largely ignored or downplayed stories of Solomon's magical powers, another tradition was developing: Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism. The Kabbalists sought to understand the hidden dimensions of Torah, the secret names of God, the structure of divine emanation into the world. For them, every letter of Hebrew scripture contained infinite depths of meaning. Every biblical story concealed layers of mystical truth. And Solomon, the wise king, the builder of the temple, became a key figure in their meditations. In Kabbalistic thought, Solomon's wisdom was not merely practical discernment but deep knowledge of the Sephirot, the 10 divine attributes or emanations through which God relates to creation. Solomon understood the structure of reality itself, the pathways by which divine light descends and human prayer ascends. And the ring. In Kabbalistic literature, the Ring of Solomon becomes a symbol of such profound complexity that it can barely be called a physical object at all. Picture the ring as a Kabbalist might meditate upon it. It is circular without beginning or end, representing the Ein Sof, the infinite God beyond all attributes. The seal upon it is a geometric pattern, perhaps the hexagram formed by 2 interlocking triangles, representing the descent of divine influence, the downward-pointing triangle, and the ascent of human aspiration, the upward-pointing triangle. Or perhaps it is a pattern of 10 points representing the Sephirot, or 22 segments representing the letters of the Hebrew alphabet, or 72 divisions representing the names of God derived from Exodus 14, 19-21. The ring is worn on the finger, the body participating in the symbol. When Solomon extended his hand bearing the ring, he united body and spirit, material and immaterial, human will and divine power. The ring was the meeting point, the place where different orders of reality touched. In some Kabbalistic texts, the ring is associated with specific Sephirot. Yesod, the 9th Sephirah, is called the foundation, and it is symbolically represented as a ring or covenant. It is the point through which divine energy flows into the material world. Solomon possessing this ring means Solomon consciously working with this flow, understanding and directing it according to divine will. The Zohar, the central text of Kabbalah traditionally attributed to Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai but compiled in 13th century Spain, discusses Solomon extensively. In one section, it speaks of a ring that Solomon received from heaven, a ring that helped him build the temple, but the language is deeply symbolic, layered with references to divine names, angelic princes, and the correct performance of ritual. Listen to the rhythm of these ideas. In Kabbalah, everything physical has a spiritual root. Material objects are manifestations of spiritual realities. A ring is never just a ring. It is metal and gem drawn from the earth, shaped by human craft, but also an expression of divine patterns, a focus for meditation and intention. So when the Kabbalist asks, "Did Solomon have a ring?" the question itself must be reframed. Did the ring exist on the material plane? Perhaps, yes. A physical ring, gold and gem, worn on Solomon's hand. But that physical ring was real only because it manifested a deeper reality, a spiritual pattern that existed before the ring was made and would continue to exist after the ring was lost or destroyed. The Kabbalistic perspective suggests that object and symbol are not opposites but different levels of the same reality. The object is the symbol made manifest. The symbol is the object understood truly. To ask which is real is to misunderstand the nature of reality itself, which is layered, multidimensional, simultaneously physical and spiritual. This perspective influenced Jewish approaches to magical practice. While mainstream rabbinical Judaism discouraged magic, there was a tradition of practical Kabbalah that included making amulets, reciting divine names for protection or healing, and yes, sometimes creating talismans including rings. But these practices were understood within the Kabbalistic framework. The power came not from the physical object, but from the divine reality it accessed. The object was a tool, a focus, an aid to concentration and intention. But without proper intention, without understanding, without spiritual preparation, the object was worthless. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal but instructive, about a Kabbalist who was asked to make a protective ring for a wealthy merchant. The Kabbalist created the ring with great care, inscribing it with divine names, consecrating it with prayer and meditation. He gave it to the merchant with instructions. Wear this ring always, and whenever you face danger, look at it and remember that you are in God's hands. Years later, the merchant returned, amazed. "Your ring has saved my life many times," he exclaimed. "Once I was about to be robbed, but I looked at the ring and the robbers fled. Once I was sick unto death, but I prayed over the ring and recovered. How did you give it such power?" The Kabbalist smiled. "I inscribed upon it the words Gam Ze Yaver, this too shall pass. The ring has no power except what you give it through your own faith and understanding. It reminds you of truth, and truth protects you." Whether this story reflects actual Kabbalistic practice is less important than what it teaches about the relationship between object and meaning. The ring is real, it exists, it can be seen and touched. But its reality as a protective amulet depends entirely on its function as a reminder, a symbol, a focusing point for spiritual awareness. Let yourself sink deeper now. Your thoughts are becoming dreamlike, images flowing into one another. A golden ring catches the light. Is it in a museum case? In a king's treasure room? In the realm of pure idea? Perhaps all of these or none. Perhaps the ring exists in that strange space where stories live, real enough to change hearts and minds, elusive enough to avoid the cage of final definition. Part 6. The Enlightenment and the Question of Evidence. Time moves forward. By the 17th and 18th centuries, Europe is changing. The scientific revolution brings new ways of knowing, new standards for evidence. The Enlightenment champions reason, skepticism, the clear light of investigation. Magic and mysticism begin to be seen as superstition, remnants of a darker past. And yet the story of Solomon's ring does not disappear. Instead, it transforms again, adapting to new intellectual climates. Scholars begin to study the grimoires not as manuals for practice, but as historical documents. What can these texts tell us about medieval and Renaissance beliefs? How did magical practice relate to religion, science, philosophy? The ring becomes an object of academic investigation. Historians look for evidence. Did Solomon really exist? Most scholars say yes. The biblical account, while embellished, likely preserves memory of a historical king who ruled in Jerusalem around the 10th century BCE. Archaeological evidence is slim but suggestive. We have no contemporary inscriptions mentioning Solomon, but the pattern of settlement and building in Iron Age Israel is consistent with centralized monarchy emerging during this period. But a magical ring. For this, there is no evidence whatsoever. No ancient Near Eastern text outside the biblical tradition mentions Solomon having a ring. No archaeological excavation has uncovered a ring that could plausibly be identified as Solomon's. If such a ring existed and was as important as later legends claim, surely it would have left some trace in the material record. Enlightenment rationalists thus concluded, the ring was a fiction, a legend, nothing more. Solomon may have been a real king, but the stories of his magical ring were medieval fairy tales, products of an age of credulity. But notice what happens in this dismissal. By declaring the ring purely fictional, the rationalists were answering our question definitively. It was never an object. It was only symbol, or more precisely, only superstition. But in doing so, they missed something important. They failed to ask, why did this particular symbol have such power? Why did so many different cultures, across so many centuries, find meaning in the story of Solomon's ring? Some Enlightenment thinkers were more nuanced. The philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, for instance, was interested in symbolism, in the ways that signs and representations function in human thought. For Leibniz, the question of whether Solomon's ring really existed as a physical object was less interesting than the question of what the ring meant, how it functioned in systems of belief and practice. Others went further. Perhaps, they suggested, the ring had existed but was nothing like the legends described. Perhaps Solomon, like many ancient Near Eastern kings, had worn a signet ring, a ring bearing his royal seal, used to stamp documents and mark official business. Such rings were common among rulers. They were symbols of authority, and documents sealed with the king's ring had legal force. Could this be the origin of the legend? A simple signet ring, misunderstood by later generations who no longer remembered the mundane function of such seals. Over centuries, as the story passed through multiple cultures and languages, could an ordinary royal seal have been transformed into a magical talisman? This is an elegant hypothesis. It would explain how the legend arose from a kernel of historical fact. It would preserve a sense that, yes, the ring existed, while also explaining why no magical properties can be verified. The object was real, the symbolism was added later. And yet, this explanation is not entirely satisfying. It reduces the rich tapestry of legend to a case of mistaken identity, of confusion compounded over time. It cannot account for why the ring legends took the specific forms they did, why Solomon gained power over demons rather than, say, power over weather or wild beasts. It cannot explain the deep resonances the ring legends had with mystical and theological concerns in multiple religious traditions. Perhaps a better approach is to recognize that historical fact and meaningful fiction are not opposed but intertwined. The Enlightenment wanted to separate them cleanly. This happened, that didn't. This is true, that is false. But human experience is not so neat. We live in webs of meaning where facts and interpretations, objects and symbols, constantly interact. Let your mind rest with this complexity. You don't need to solve it. Like a child watching patterns in firelight, you can simply observe, notice, wonder. The ring appears and disappears, now shining with metallic gleam, now dissolving into pure idea. Both aspects are real in their own way. Both are illusions in their own way. Opposites meet and merge in the half-light of approaching sleep. Part 7. Romanticism, Occultism, and Revival. The 19th century brought reaction against Enlightenment rationalism. The Romantic movement celebrated emotion, imagination, intuition. Poets and artists looked back to the medieval period with nostalgia, seeing in it a lost wholeness, a time when the world was still enchanted. This cultural shift created space for renewed interest in occultism. Magical lodges and societies formed, drawing on Kabbalistic, Hermetic, and Masonic traditions. The grimoires were republished, translated, studied with new seriousness, not as historical curiosities but as potential guides to practice. One of the most influential figures in this occult revival was Eliphas Lévy, born Alphonse Louis Constant in France in 1810. Lévy was a failed priest, a political radical, a writer and lecturer who reinvented himself as a magician and teacher of occult arts. His books, especially Dogme et Rituel de la Haute Magie, The Doctrine and Ritual of High Magic, published in the 1850s, became foundational texts for modern Western occultism. Lévy wrote extensively about Solomon's ring. For him, the ring was absolutely real, but its reality was not straightforwardly physical. The ring existed, Lévy taught, on what he called the astral plane, a subtle dimension of reality intermediate between the purely material and the purely spiritual. To create Solomon's ring was to fashion not just a physical object but an astral form, a pattern in subtle matter that could influence both spiritual and physical realms. The process of creating such a ring, according to Lévy, required not just manual skill but magical will, the trained ability to impress thought forms into astral substance. Any skilled jeweler could fashion a metal ring, but only a true adept could create a magical ring, because only an adept could operate simultaneously on physical and astral planes. This is a sophisticated position. It doesn't simply say the ring is physical or the ring is symbolic. Instead, it proposes a layered ontology where the ring exists at multiple levels simultaneously. On the physical level, it is metal and gem. On the astral level, it is a condensation of magical will. On the symbolic level, it is an image that communicates meaning to the conscious and unconscious mind. All three levels are real. All three are necessary for the ring to function magically. Lévy influenced countless later occultists. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, founded in England in 1887, taught a system of magic that included the creation of talismanic rings based on planetary and zodiacal correspondences. Members learned elaborate rituals for consecrating rings, drawing on Kabbalistic, Egyptian, and Solomonic traditions. Some members claimed to have created effective magical rings. Others understood the practice primarily as psychological training, a way of developing focus and will. Aleister Crowley, perhaps the most famous or infamous occultist of the 20th century, wrote about magical rings in his various works. Crowley's position was characteristically provocative. Magic, he insisted, was real, but real meant something more subtle than most people understood. Magic works by influencing consciousness, by creating psychological conditions that allow practitioners to access latent potentials. A magical ring is a tool for focus, an anchor for concentration, a physical reminder of intention. It is real as a tool, whether it channels supernatural forces or simply harnesses natural psychological processes is, Crowley suggested, ultimately not the important question. Think of a ring in this framework. You hold it in your hand. It is metal, solid, measurable, weighable. But as you wear it, as you meditate upon it, as you associate it with specific intentions and experiences, it becomes something more. It becomes a trigger for particular mental states. When you look at it, you remember your purpose. You access the mindset you've trained. The ring hasn't changed physically, but its functional reality has expanded. Is this magic? Is this psychology? The modern occultists suggested these might be the same thing seen from different angles. Solomon's ring, in this view, was a profound understanding of how consciousness works, how intention can be focused and directed, how external objects can serve as anchors for internal states. Whether Solomon understood this in terms of demons and angels or in terms of psychology and neurology is secondary. The practical reality is the same. This perspective allows us to say, yes, Solomon could have had a physical ring, and yes, that ring could have functioned magically, and yes, the ring is ultimately symbolic. All three statements are true because symbolic doesn't mean unreal or merely imaginary. Symbols are among the most powerful realities humans experience. A flag is cloth and dye, but it is also a symbol that people will die for. A wedding ring is metal, but it is also a symbol that transforms identities and relationships. Solomon's ring could be metal and symbol simultaneously, object and idea, tool and meaning. Your body is very relaxed now, limbs heavy, breathing slow and deep. The boundaries between concepts grow fuzzy. You understand that this is not confusion but a different kind of clarity, the clarity that comes when we stop trying to force reality into rigid categories and instead let it show itself in all its fluidity. Part 8. Modern archaeological and scholarly perspectives. In the 20th and 21st centuries, biblical archaeology has become a sophisticated discipline. Teams of scholars excavate sites throughout Israel and surrounding regions, seeking to understand the material culture of the ancient world. Laboratories date artifacts with increasing precision. Texts are analyzed with philological and historical critical methods. What has all this scholarship revealed about Solomon? The picture is complex and contested. Some scholars, often called biblical minimalists, argue that the biblical account of Solomon is largely legendary, that if a king named Solomon existed, his kingdom was small and unimpressive, nothing like the glorious empire described in Scripture. They point to the lack of monumental architecture that can definitively be dated to Solomon's reign, the absence of contemporary inscriptions mentioning him, the way the biblical account seems to reflect later ideals projected backward. Other scholars, biblical maximalists, argue that the biblical account, while certainly containing legendary elements, preserves genuine historical memory. They point to evidence of centralized state formation in 10th century BCE Israel, to building projects that might be Solomonic, to indirect evidence from surrounding cultures that confirms a powerful kingdom in the region during this period. But neither side claims to have found any evidence of a magical ring. This is not surprising. Personal items of jewelry rarely survive from the ancient world, and even when they do, connecting them to specific individuals is nearly impossible. We don't have David's harp, Moses' staff, or Abraham's sandals. Why would we have Solomon's ring? Moreover, signet rings, ordinary administrative tools used by ancient rulers, would not have been treated as sacred relics requiring special preservation. After Solomon's death, his signet ring would likely have been passed to his successor, reused, eventually lost or melted down. The object itself would have had no more permanence than any other piece of ancient jewelry. So the archaeological silence regarding Solomon's ring tells us little. It confirms that if such a ring existed, it was not preserved and has not been found. But this was always the most likely scenario, magical properties or not. What about textual scholarship? Here the picture is clearer. The earliest texts about Solomon, the biblical books of Kings and Chronicles, compiled in their current form around the 6th century BCE but drawing on older sources, do not mention a magical ring. The texts that do mention the ring, the Testament of Solomon, various grimoires, Islamic Qisas al-Anbiya, date from late antiquity or the medieval period, centuries after Solomon's supposed lifetime. This chronology suggests that the ring entered Solomon's legend during the Second Temple period or later, as part of the broader development of Jewish angelology and demonology, influenced by Persian and Hellenistic ideas. The ring was not part of the original historical memory of Solomon, but was added as the tradition developed. But, and this is important, recognizing that something is a later addition to a tradition doesn't mean it's meaningless or worthless. Traditions develop, stories grow. The question is not whether the ring was part of the original story, but what the ring meant to the communities that added it, preserved it, and found significance in it. Some modern scholars approach the ring as an example of mythopoeic thought, the ancient tendency to think in images, symbols, and stories rather than abstract concepts. In this view, when ancient and medieval people wanted to express the idea that Solomon had divine authority, they naturally expressed it through an object, a ring bearing God's name. The ring was how they thought about and communicated abstract concepts of authority, wisdom, and power. Other scholars emphasize the social functions of the ring legends. Stories of Solomon's magical ring served to establish Solomon as a model of wise kingship, connect Jewish tradition to prestigious ancient wisdom, provide a framework for thinking about the relationship between divine and human power, offer templates for magical practice and spiritual discipline, create a shared imaginative world that linked Jewish, Christian, and Islamic cultures. From these perspectives, the question, was the ring real, becomes, what work did belief in the ring do for people? And the answer is, a great deal of work. The ring organized thought, guided practice, transmitted values, created community. This functional approach doesn't dismiss the ring as mere fiction. Rather, it recognizes that objects in human culture are never mere anything. They are nodes in networks of meaning, and their reality is inseparable from those networks. The Ring of Solomon was real in the sense that it existed in texts, in practices, in imagination, and these are all sites of genuine reality, not illusions to be dispelled. Lie quietly and let these scholarly perspectives settle. They don't solve our mystery, but they deepen it, showing us that the question of the ring's reality is tangled up with questions about history, tradition, meaning, and how humans create and transmit culture. The ring exists in the space between what happened and what is remembered, between individual artifact and collective symbol, between past and present. Part 9. The ring in popular culture. Before we conclude, let us acknowledge one more layer: the Ring of Solomon in modern popular culture. In novels, films, video games, and other media, the ring continues to appear, continues to capture imagination. Sometimes it appears in historical fiction or fantasy, loosely based on biblical stories. Here the ring is typically portrayed as a powerful magical artifact, perhaps the most powerful artifact in the world, given to Solomon by God or angels, lost after his death, and sought by various characters who want its power. These stories draw on the medieval grimoire traditions and Islamic legends, blending them into new narratives. Other times the ring appears as a minor element in larger fantasy worlds. In role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons, Ring of Solomon, or Seal of Solomon, might be a treasure item, granting the wearer power over extraplanar beings or the ability to understand all languages. These games reduce complex legends to game mechanics, turning the ring into a tool with quantified abilities. But in doing so, they testify to the ring's continuing power as an image. The ring also appears in conspiracy theories and alternative history narratives. Some claim that secret societies possess Solomon's ring and use its power to control world events. Others believe the ring is hidden in some remote location, waiting to be rediscovered. These narratives are usually dismissed by scholars, but they show how the ring continues to function as a symbol of hidden knowledge and occult power. Perhaps most interestingly, the Ring of Solomon sometimes appears in psychological and self-help contexts. Solomon's ring becomes a metaphor for inner wisdom, for the ability to understand and master one's own thoughts and emotions. In this usage, we see the complete transformation of the ring from object to internalized symbol. To find Solomon's ring is to achieve self-knowledge. To wear Solomon's ring is to act with wisdom and authority in one's own life. All of these uses, from serious magical practice to game mechanics to pop psychology, are part of the ring's reality. The ring exists wherever people think about it, talk about it, tell stories about it. Its existence is distributed across cultures and media, across centuries and contexts. It is an object that exists primarily as symbol, or a symbol that sometimes pretends to be an object, or perhaps something for which we don't have adequate language, something that is object and symbol and neither and both. Let these images wash over you. Solomon on his throne, ring gleaming on his finger, demons bowing before him. A medieval magician in a circle, holding up a consecrated ring, calling upon angels. a Kabbalist meditating on geometric patterns, seeing in the ring's circle a reflection of infinity, an archaeologist's hand dusty from excavation, finding nothing, a child reading a story, imagining what it would be like to have such a ring, to have such power. All of these are part of the ring's story. The ring is all of these things: historical artifact that may never have existed, literary motif, magical tool, spiritual symbol, cultural memory, psychological archetype. Part 10. Conclusion: Living with Mystery. We have traveled far together through history, tradition, interpretation. We have seen the Ring of Solomon appear in Jewish pseudepigrapha, Islamic legend, Christian grimoires, Kabbalistic meditation, Enlightenment skepticism, romantic occultism, modern scholarship, and popular culture. We have watched it shift from object to symbol and back again. Or rather, we have watched different communities and individuals emphasize different aspects of its reality. So we return to our question: is Solomon's ring an object or a symbol? And perhaps now we can see that this question, posed as a simple alternative, cannot capture the ring's complexity. The ring is not object or symbol but object and symbol, existing in the space between these categories, drawing meaning from both. If Solomon really lived, he may well have worn a signet ring. That would have been normal for a king. That physical ring, pressed into clay or wax, made his authority tangible, turned his will into visible mark. In that sense, the ring was an object with real effects in the material world. But the legends that grew around the ring, the stories of it bearing divine names and commanding spirits, reflect something beyond any physical object. They reflect humanity's need to understand wisdom and power, to imagine how the divine might empower the human, to create symbols that connect visible and invisible realities. In that sense, the ring was always a symbol, a way of thinking about things that resist straightforward description. The deepest truth may be this: the distinction between object and symbol is itself less stable than we usually assume. Objects in human culture are always more than their physical properties. A crown is gold and gems, but it is also authority. A flag is fabric and dye, but it is also identity and allegiance. A wedding ring is metal, but it is also love and commitment. The meaning is not added to the object from outside. The meaning is part of what makes the object what it is. In this light, Solomon's ring is profoundly real, not necessarily as a specific ancient artifact that could be excavated and displayed in a museum, but as a living symbol that has shaped thought and practice for more than 2,000 years. It has organized magical rituals, inspired mystical meditations, provoked philosophical debates, sparked literary imagination. It has helped people think about wisdom, power, divine favor, spiritual discipline, and the limits of human knowledge. This cultural and spiritual reality is not less real than physical reality. It is simply real in a different way. And perhaps this is the lesson Solomon's ring teaches: that reality is larger and stranger than we often think, that matter and meaning interweave constantly, that the boundaries between history and legend, fact and symbol, object and idea are permeable, negotiable, mysterious. Can you hold Solomon's ring in your hand? Perhaps not. The physical object, if it ever existed, is lost to time. But you hold it in your mind every time you contemplate it, every time you wonder about wisdom and how it is gained, every time you consider the relationship between power and its symbols. And in that holding, in that contemplation, the ring is present, real, effective. This is the paradox and the gift. The most powerful objects may be those we cannot touch, and the most real presences may be those we cannot see. Solomon's ring exists in story, in symbol, in the space where human imagination meets divine mystery. It is there, in that space, that we actually live most of our lives, not in a world of bare material fact, but in a world saturated with meaning, where objects speak, symbols act, and a ring can be both lost and found, both physical and spiritual, both object and idea. Sleep now. Let your questions rest. The ring turns slowly in darkness, catching no light because there is no light to catch, or perhaps glowing with its own luminescence. the letters upon it writing and rewriting themselves across the centuries. It is Solomon's ring, and it is your ring, and it is no one's ring, and it belongs to everyone who wonders about wisdom, who seeks to understand, who lives in the beautiful uncertainty between what we know and what we imagine. The story continues. It has no end. Like the ring itself, it is circular, returning always to its beginning, which is also its end, which is also its middle. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, rest in the mystery, and let the mystery rest in you. The ring is real. The ring is symbol. The ring is both. The ring is neither. All of these statements are true, and their truth is the truth of paradox, the truth that awakens not answers but deeper questions, the truth that invites not closure but openness, not grasping but wonder. This is Solomon's wisdom. To know that we do not know, to hold lightly what we think we understand, to remain always curious, always humble, always aware that the most important truths cannot be possessed but only received as gifts, again and again, new each time, like the light that breaks each morning over Jerusalem, that ancient city where a king once reigned, wise and powerful, wearing perhaps a ring, or perhaps carrying wisdom in his heart, or perhaps, most likely, both, in ways we can imagine but never quite grasp, in ways that change with each telling, in ways that remain true precisely because they remain mysterious, flexible, alive. Sleep well. Dream of rings and wisdom, of kings and symbols, of objects that mean and meanings that take form. Dream of Solomon, whoever he was, whatever he wore, whatever his ring, if he had one, might have been. Dream yourself toward morning, and wake when you wake, slightly wiser for having rested with the mystery, slightly more comfortable with not knowing, slightly more aware that the deepest realities are those we can circle around, speak about, wonder at, but never quite pinned down, and that this is not a failure but a feature, not a problem but a gift. The story ends, or rather it pauses. The ring waits for the next telling, the next interpretation, the next dreamer to pick it up and turn it in the light and see, reflected in its surface, their own face wondering, their own mind reaching toward wisdom, their own soul seeking the connection between earth and heaven, object and meaning, the physical and the spiritual, the real and the symbolic, the question and the answer that is not quite an answer but another, deeper question. Rest, sleep, dream, and in your dreaming perhaps you will see a ring and understand, without words, without need for words, what it means, what it has always meant, what it will always mean, spinning slowly in the darkness behind your eyes, real and unreal, object and symbol, Solomon's and everyone's and no one's, yours and not yours, gift and mystery and truth. Good night.